The book known as Yosifun, cherished in traditional Jewish circles, and the books of Josephus, preserved in Greek by non-Jewish hands, spark challenging questions about authorship, reliability, and reconstructing the Jewish past. This class explores how rabbis throughout the ages evaluated these works, their role on the Jewish bookshelf, and how to navigate the apparent discrepancies between their accounts and the teachings of chazal. Sometime around the year 1480, there was a sefer that was printed in Mantua in Italy. And the reason that's important or significant is because 1480 is the very beginning of Jewish printing. The first Jewish books are assumed to have been printed around the year 1470. So this is within the first decade or so of Jewish printing. And the title of this book is called Sefer Ben Gurion. More about the name later. And this book tells, in part at least, the story of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And toward the end, we're going to read one passage that is there in this volume, in this story. Vayhi b'pascham es hashar, and when the Romans opened up the gates to the Beis HaMikdash, vayiru, and they saw v'hine aderech ha'helech es kodesh kadoshim, they saw the path that's headed toward the kodesh kadoshim, the most holy and sacred part of the Beis HaMikdash. Vayachmoil olav Titus. So Titus, or as they say in English, Titus, who's the Roman general who is leading the Roman troops at this time. So Vayachmoil, the text says that he had mercy, he had compassion. In what sense? Vayomer al anoshav, he told his people, Chidlu lachem min abayis, leave this house alone, don't destroy it, Ad asher tikun lanu adeh, until we figure out, until we discuss what we want to do with this building. This text doesn't say Vayachmoil only one time. With regard to Titus, it says, throughout the narrative, it says at least 5 times, 5 additional times, and probably even more, where it uses the language that Titus had rachmanis, that Titus had mercy. He had mercy on people, and here he had mercy on a building. Vayanu sarei reimanim vayomru la'adeneim lemor. So the war ministers of the Romans, they responded to his lieutenants. They responded to him and said, if we destroy this house, then we'll be able to destroy this people. They're dying for the building. So if we get rid of the building, then they'll have no reason to fight anymore. So in other words, it is a legitimate war objective for us to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. On the next day, but at the end of the day, Titus's order was an order. Don't touch it. The next day, the Romans gathered, and indeed someone started a fire burning the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And at that moment, the Romans made a very large noise, and Titus, who was just waking up in the morning, he's in his tent, he's not at the scene. So he comes running over really quickly because he hears this noise. And he sees the flames and he wants to stop. He wants to stop the fire. He wants to extinguish the flames. But he couldn't do it. There were so many people who were there that he couldn't get through, or they were blocking him, or they were obstructing him. So he's yelling, no one's listening to him. He takes his sword out. Vayachel ligor b'sarei amoy, and he's yelling at the officers, lahakos becharev es hanachrim, to kill the Gentiles, laman yigarshu misham, to get rid of them. Maybe the intention here is mercenaries, non-Roman mercenaries who were part of the troop, and they were causing the problem. And so he's telling his Roman officers to strike them, so to get rid of them. But this too didn't work. Many of the non-Jews died here. Vayitzach bahem, and Titus is still going around and he's yelling and he's screaming out, Nichar groina, he lost his voice. V'lo yuchal litzoik, and poor Titus, he can't scream anymore. And now he realizes he has to give up. There's no way he could save the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the most sacred part of the Beis HaMikdash. He says, let me chop a glimpse. Let me get one look before this thing goes down. It's a little interesting to walk into a burning building, but okay. And he sees the structure and how beautiful it is. And he believed that this is the house of God and where Hashem dwells. Now we understood it wasn't for naught that the Jews waged battle for their rights to this building. Because indeed the honor and the prestige of this sanctuary is greater than anything the Romans had. And for any other Gentile shrine that I have seen. So says Titus on the day of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, according to this account in the Sefer Ben Gurion that is printed in Mantua in the year 1480. This is the first edition of a book that gets printed many, many times in the generations and years that follow. Now, what's interesting about this passage and the problem with this passage is that we try to reconcile this with what Chazal tell us about Titus, and this becomes exceedingly difficult. Where do we see this? Let's turn to the Gemara in Gittin, Daf Nuvav Amud Beis. The Gemara there tells on a pasuk in Parshas Hazinu. The pasuk says, "Va'amar Eyalikemai tzur chasayu boy." Rashi tells us there are two interpretations of this pasuk. The first interpretation is that God is speaking here, but that's not relevant to this drasha, so we'll put that aside. The second interpretation here is that a Rasha is speaking. The Rasha says, Eyalikemai, where is your God? Tzur chasayu boy, the rock that you took refuge in. Titus is saying this. Says the Gemara, Zat Titus HaRasha. This is referring to Titus. That was his attitude. Essentially denying the Jewish God. Because he was extremely disrespectful toward Hashem. Also, what did he do? Tafas Zaina biyadai, that violent language. He grabbed a Zaina, a prostitute, by hand, v'nichnas lebeis kachei HaKadoshim, entered the kachei HaKadoshim, v'yitzia sefer Torah, placed the sefer Torah down, v'avar ala aveira, and on top of the sefer Torah, he committed a sin. So that's Gila Aroyas, as well as abusing a Sefer Torah. But in addition to that, Venat al Sayaf, he took a sword, Vigider es haparoiches, and he stabbed the paroiches, the curtain dividing the Kodesh HaKadoshim from the rest of the Beis HaMikdash. Venasanes, a miracle occurred, V'hayadam mivatzbeis v'yoytza, and blood started flowing forth from this curtain. Uchasavar, so he thought haragas atzmai, which is a euphemistic way that the Gemara is saying he thought that he had killed that he had performed deicide, that he had killed the Almighty. This is the passage that Chazal tell us about Titus. It's part of the larger sugya in Gemara Gittin, where it talks about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and what you immediately see over here is a little bit of a different type of picture. Not someone who is very respectful of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to say the least, but in fact the opposite. So this poses a significant problem for this passage that we just read from Sefer Ben Gurion, which invites us to ask the simple question: what is this Sefer Ben Gurion? When was it written, and by whom? As it is going to become apparent, this, on the one hand, it's a simple answer, but at the same time, it's not going to be so simple. So in order to figure all of this out, we're going to begin with a manuscript. This manuscript is known as Borgiani Hebreo 1, which sits today in the Vatican Library. And this manuscript is a manuscript of the same work, the Sefer Ben Gurion. But what's unique over here in this one manuscript, and it's the only one in the world that has this, is it has a hakdama. It has an introduction. An introduction not written by an author, but written by a much later head. This manuscript is from the late 1400s. However, it is copying a hakdama that existed earlier from a man whose name is going to become apparent to us in a second, who lived in the 1300s. So let's read the hakdama that is in this manuscript. It begins like this. Amar Yehuda HaMachuna Leon. So the speaker is saying, I am Yehuda, who's known as Leon, or Leon. Remember that Leon in Greek is the way you say lion, and Yehuda is Aryeh, Yehuda is Leib, and so therefore, just like Yehuda would be called Leib, so if you're influenced more by the Greek, you'd be called Leon. If you're influenced more by the Latin, you'd be called Leo. So my name is Yehuda ben Harav Moshe HaMachuna Mashkoini, and my father is Moshe, and I guess Mashkoini is the nickname for Moshe. We know who this Yehuda HaMashkoini is. Yehuda HaMashkoini lived in the 1300s, and he wrote a commentary on Ibn Ezra's commentary to the Chumash. So this is a well-known individual. And he wrote a hakdama, a lengthy hakdama, to this book, Sefer Ben Gurion, and we're going to be reading right now from this hakdama. Again, it survives in one single manuscript that's today in the Vatican. What does it say in this Hakdama? HaSefer Hazeh, this book, Hu HaSefer HaGadol, this is the significant work, or the big work, Asher Chibra Yosef HaKoyen Ben Gurion. Here's the author. The author's name is Yosef HaKoyen. His father's name is Gurion. Menuchasei Kavod, who has passed away. What was the method of this author? Vayalaket Yosef Esipuri HaSefer Hazeh, and Yosef collected the stories that he has in this book, from the earlier scribes who he believed were trustworthy, from earlier authors who he believed were trustworthy. And he goes on to enumerate who these people were. But in addition to relying on other scribes, he also could rely on himself. Why is that? Because Gam Siper Boy Kolat La'ois Akshakarli Yisrael Biyamav. Because he also wrote about all the events that happened in his day. When did he live? We didn't say where he lived yet. We didn't say when he lived yet. He lived in his day, in the generation that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. He saw the Beis HaMikdash built. He also saw the Beis HaMikdash destroyed. Yosifun, and he, Mr. Yosef, the son of Gurion, called the book Yosifun. Why? Al Shema Yasher Hoya Yosifun, because his name was Yosifun. Why was his name Yosifun? I thought you just told me his name was Yosef. See, he goes on to say, Vayishem Yosef Yosifun. When did his name change from Yosef to Yosifun? Miyoimi Mashchay Limashuach Mochama Alam Hashem. So here you learn another important piece of information about him, because this individual was a general. He was a Kayam Mashuach Mochama, and a Kayam Mashuach Mochama. There's this concept of a nom de guerre, like this name that you have when you go into battle. So his nom de guerre became Yosifun. How do I know that? It actually says it inside the book that he's calling Yosifun. So before we were calling it the book Ben Gurion, now we're calling the book Yosifun. It's all the same thing. The man's name is Yosef Ben Gurion. His name was also Yosifun. That was the name he got when he became the general, and it says that clearly inside the book of Yosifun. Now, what's interesting for our author here, Reb Yehuda, who's writing sometime in the 1300s, is he doesn't really see how going from Yosef to Yosifun, how that's like honorific. He doesn't see how that brings honor to someone. In fact, he sees the name more as, what's the word, like diminutive. He sees it like it's more like mataleh. Yosef, Yosifun. So he's bothered a little by that. So he says, you know what the explanation for that is? To the contrary, because he was becoming a general and it could get to your head, so the special name that they gave him was like this cute little name which reminded him to have a little humility. So that's his understanding of the name Yosifun. Now, he goes on, Rabbi Yehuda does, and he demonstrates some awareness of the non-Jewish library as well. This book, the Greeks also have it. In other words, there's a Greek copy of this book. How did it get to Greek? I'll tell you. It was translated. Originally, the principal work is in Hebrew, and from Hebrew, it was translated into Greek. Yosifus, right? Greeks like ending things with us. So Yosef, Yosifus. So that's the name. It's in Latin as well, by the Romans. And all those who aren't Roman per se, but are Christian. And here it was translated from Hebrew to Latin. They call it Josephus. Okay, Josephus. All right, that's the Latin. But he wants you to be sure. Don't make sure you remember. He wrote it in Hebrew. He says over here, he's called Yosifun and Yosefun. I'm going to leave that alone. Okay, but the original work is in Lashon HaKodesh. This is what Reb Yehuda Mashkoini says, writing sometime in the 1300s. Now what's interesting is, one of the things that I'm interested in is, at what point did Jews or did rabbis become familiar that there is a parallel copy in the non-Jewish community? So he's of the first I was able to see is him. Is this Rabbi Yehuda Mashkoini sometime in the 1300s? The other important thing, and this is very important for the book that we're for the rest of the shir just going to call Yosifun. V'da'oid, and you should know, Ki anachnu kasher kasavnu lanu es hasefer hazeh. You should know that when we wrote this book, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Mashkoini, sometime in the 1300s, wanted to put together a definitive manuscript of Yosifun. So when he sat, and to that end, he did two things. First of all, he wrote a wonderful introduction. But in addition to that, he wanted to get a good text. He wanted to produce a good text. But I had 4 different versions of Yosifun. And all of them had variations, missing different stories. Each one had things the other one didn't have. Then he goes on to say we had a 5th version, and that's the one we relied on. And that seemed to be the best one, but even that one didn't have everything that the other ones had. The reason I'm showing this to you is because when you look at Yosifun's, each one of the prints have significant differences between them, and that's something that anyway is going to surface soon, so I might as well show you that already Rabbi Yehuda Mashkoini was aware of this. But what's the main thing I want to take away from Rabbi Yehuda Mashkoini is, there are 2 versions of this Rabbi Yosef's work. Which one is the original? The original is in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh. There was then children, progeny that were born from that, translated from that into Greek and into Roman that the non-Jews have. Now there's another way of understanding the 2 versions that exist, and that is if you turn to the work of Yosifun itself, not the version from Mantua that I showed you, and not this manuscript either. But if you turn to the standard version was printed in Yerushalayim in Tafshin Tazayin in 1956. In chapter 3, Yosifun is writing. And he's writing about the Persian period, and he says, if you want to know more about it, you could look al Sefer Malchei Modai Ufaras, you could learn more about the Persian period. And in fact, Va'al Sifri Ani Yosef HaKoyen Ben Gurion HaKoyen, you could look at my works, Asher Kasaftiv Leroimiim, that I wrote for the Romans, that I wrote in Latin, V'hu HaSefer HaNikra Yosifus, and that is known as Josephus. V'aniu Yosef Ben Gurion, and I am Yosef Ben Gurion Asher Higlu Oisi Titus V'Aspasianus Merushalayim. I was taken by Titus and by his father Aspasianus, or Vespasian. I was taken from Yerushalayim to Rome, which becomes clear in these works, in both of them. It says the same thing, that he's taken to Rome, and that's where he lives out his final years over there. Okay, good. But this I wrote for Jews. And I'm writing about the things that I saw. I tried to battle for Hashem as best as I could. So that, kasafti b'sefer shishi, that's in section 6 of this book, Yosifun. But all 6 sections of this book, Yosifun, I wrote in Hebrew. Well, what are you getting from this passage that is in some versions of Yosifun? You're getting at, is there 2 versions? Absolutely, there's 2 versions. There's a Hebrew version, and there is he's not clear about what language the other version is, but there's an alternate version that exists for the nations of the world or for the Romans. However, which one is the original? According to him, unlike Yehuda Mashkoini, we're hot and cup, right? Yehuda Mashkoini said what? That the original is Hebrew. What's he saying over here? He's saying over here, they're both original. They're both original. He wrote both. He wrote a Jewish version, and he wrote a non-Jewish version. And so right now, we have 2 ways of understanding what this is. Now, this idea that he originally wrote 2 versions, if you actually open the Greek version, has support for that. In the Greek version, there's support for the idea that he originally wrote 2 versions. So let's open the Greek version. This is known as the Jewish War, right in the beginning of the book. Translated into English, it says as follows. I, Josephus, son of Matisyahu. We'll come back to that in a second, because till now his name is Yosef ben Gurion. Now it's Yosef ben Matisyahu. So we'll come back to that in a second. A Hebrew by race, a native of Jerusalem, and a priest, who at the opening of the war myself fought against the Romans, and in the sequel, meaning after that, was perforce an onlooker. Then I exited from the war and was just observing. So I propose to provide the subjects of the Roman Empire with a narrative of the facts by translating into Greek the account which I previously composed in my vernacular tongue. What's his vernacular? And sent to the barbarians in the interior. Barbarians just means the people who didn't speak. The Romans called anyone who didn't speak Latin, they were known as barbarians. So, and in the interior, later on, a few lines later, he explains, he's talking about the Jewish communities that lived in Bavel. They needed an account about what happened with the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and he's saying, I already wrote for them, and now I'm writing for you. Now he says in vernacular tongue, so there's really two options. What is Yosef, a Jew who grows up in Eretz Yisrael in the first century? What is his vernacular tongue? It could either be Hebrew or it could be Aramaic. The argument a little bit for Aramaic is he's saying that he wrote it for the people who are living in Bavel. That tilts a little bit in the direction that this would have been in Aramaic, but I don't know that we can know for sure. But the bottom line is, what you see over here is this supports our second theory. Our first theory was from Rabbi Yehuda Mashkoini that it was written originally in Hebrew, and then there was translations, unauthorized translations by later individuals. Our second theory is that he originally wrote both. You get that in one version of Yosifun, but you also get that in one version, in the standard Greek version, where it essentially says the same thing, that this is what he did. Later on, we're going to propose a third theory for the relationship between these two books, but for now we're going to suffice just with these two. And now a note on the name Yosef ben Matisyahu versus Yosef ben Gurion. In the Greek, he's consistently Yosef, the son of Matisyahu. There is one time in the Greek work where there is an individual named Yosef ben Gurion, Yosef the son of Gurion. One time in the Greek version that it speaks about such an individual, and he is a general in the war that has no relationship to Yosef ben Matisyahu. So his name comes up one time in the Greek. His name is Yosef ben Gurion, and nothing to do with Yosef ben Matisyahu. However, in the Yosifun, consistently, he's always named as Yosef ben Gurion. Okay, so that's Ha'ara number one. Ha'ara number two is, there is from Chazal, we know the name Gurion. The Gemara talks about a man named Nagdimoin ben Gurion as one of the wealthy people who lived in Yerushalayim in the generation of the Churban Beis HaMikdash. And so the Tzemach David, we spoke about him last time. He's Reb David Gans. He passed away in the early 1600s. He wrote a work on history. So Reb David Gans writes, well, I think that we know there's Nagdimoin ben Gurion. He's the wealthy guy, and his father's name is Gurion. So then why not? Yosef ben Gurion is his brother. He doesn't say anything other than because why not? So it's an interesting comment that he makes. But there is no solution to this problem that I'm putting out here today, that in Yosifun, his name is Yosef ben Gurion, and in the Greek, it's Yosef ben Matisyahu. Good. So far, what did we do? We learned about the fact that these two works exist, the Jewish and the non-Jewish, and we discussed two theories on the relationship between them. We'll soon discuss a third idea, or at the end of this year we'll discuss a third idea, but now we need to ask a very simple question. And the question we need to ask ourselves now is, well, this work, Yosifun, was well known to Yosifun, I'm talking about now, not Josephus. Yosifun was well known to the Go'onim, at least the later ones, and the Rishonim. So what was their yachas? How did they deal with this Sefer Yosifun? That's what I'm interested in now. So let's have a look. And we'll then we'll do the same thing for rabbis and Josephus. That we'll do later. For now, we want to know what is the rabbinic response to Yosifun. Rashi Daniel chapter 11. He's dealing here with a pasuk that says, Hinei oid shloisha malachim. It speaks about three kings and then a fourth king. This is a prophecy in Daniel about kings. What is the interpretation of this prophecy? Says Rashi, Razal Amru b'Seder Olam. Chazal say in the work, Seder Olam, when the Gemara quotes it, it treats it as a brisa. It says the Tanya, and it attributes Seder Olam, which is documents history, the order of the generations. It attributes it to a Tana Rabbi Yosi. So Chazal say in Seder Olam that you want to know who the three kings are: cherished, the first Persian king, Achashverosh, and Daryavesh. These are three kings. Shabana Abai and Daryavesh. Which one? Who built the second Beis Hamikdash? The problem is that the pasuk goes on to say that there's also a fourth king. What about the fact that there's a fourth king and we only have three? So Seder Olam, Chazal's answer is Revi'i Lamadai. It's the fourth king if you count the last king from Madai, which was Daryavesh HaMadai. So then Daryavesh HaMadai, the last one, then three kings in the Persian period, Kodesh, Achashverosh, and Daryavesh, equals 4. And so that's why it's 3 and 4. Okay, so this is Rashi's interpretation based on Chazal. Now, some people may feel that it sounds like a little bit of a doichak. Sounds like a doichak. 3 turned into 4 because you're counting, right? So maybe Rashi felt that way. What does he do? He continues. He doesn't end. And he says, Aval b'sefer Yosef ben Gurion, in the book of Yosef ben Gurion, Kasuv, Shahaya ben lekoyre shamalach tachtav. There was a child, who succeeded Kodesh, lifnei loich Achashverosh, and Shmoi Bambisha. Otherwise, in other places known as Kambisha. We actually mentioned him last week, Cambyses. So basically, Kodesh, stick in another one, fourth one. That's how you have a fourth one. That's easier. So what happened over here? Think about what's going on over here. You have there's a pasuk. Chazal tell us what they think the pasuk means. As far as I know, there's no machloikes within Chazal on what this pasuk is. It's very straightforward. There's one shita in Chazal, and that's it. Case closed. Rashi feels comfortable saying, that's what Chazal say, but Yosifun says another idea, completely different idea, which messes up the history, because now instead of 3 kings, you have 4 kings. That messes everything up. But Rashi feels comfortable saying, I don't have a problem doing that. What does that teach us? And there are many other examples of this, but this is a very good example. Because if you wanted to make a list of how many Rishonim quoted Yosifun, your list will be from here to Flatbush. It's hundreds. But if you're looking for a list of this type of mention where Chazal said A, but look, Yosef ben Gurion said different, and I'm happy quoting them side by side, and Rashi doesn't even feel like a need to say one is superior over the other. Rashi doesn't feel a need to kind of be metavich, and that is to make them work and to coincide with each other. Just like it's very normal to say, one medrash says A, but another medrash says B, or Rabbi Yehuda says A and Rabbi Meir says B, Rashi feels comfortable saying Chazal said A and Yosifun said B. That's the level of prominence that Rashi is lending to this work of Yosifun. We're going to see a little bit of a different approach, similar but different, in another work from one of the Rishonim. He lived a little later. His name was Rabbi Yehuda ben Kloinimus. He lived in the 1100s. He's one of the Bali Atoisus. He lived in the Rhineland area. And his work was actually just published a few years ago for the first time in Tafshan and Dalet in 1994 by Rabbi Blau. It's called Erchei Tanoim V'Amoraim. This is the work he wrote. And he says over here a story. I'm going to summarize it outside. He reports over here a story of an individual whose children are at battle. And he's in the Kodesh HaKadoshim because it's Yom Kippur. And his children are fighting a war. And he hears in the Kodesh HaKadoshim a voice that says, all good. Your children are doing well. Your children are doing great. This passage is quoted in Gemara in Soita, Daf Lamed Gimel. And it says over there, the place of this battle was in Antioch. However, he says, Yosifun says that it happened in Aza. And when he says the story, he actually says Aza. He doesn't say Antioch. He says the story, his default is Aza, following Yosifun. He says, by the way, Chazal said it's in Antioch. Okay. Then he goes on to say, and by the way, maybe there was the same battle, just in 2 locations at the same time, one in Antioch and one in Aza. So Yosifun spoke about Aza and Chazal spoke about Antioch, but it's really all kind of the same thing and the same type of event. Well, what's going on over here? Clearly, this Rishon is embracing Yosifun. He's embracing it. In fact, his default assumption was that it was Aza. But then what did he do? What he did after is he said, you know what? Let's kind of reconcile that. Let's make them work together. And that's another approach that we see in the era of the Rishonim, and definitely in later generations, of reconciliation. But that's for Yosifun, that's a worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that he's like another medrash, like he's another chazal, like we just saw. That's a best case scenario of the type of prominence this work is given. The worst case scenario is, okay, let's try to reconcile. Let's try to make them all fit together as one. Now, with this, let's go back to the opening which we discussed. I showed you a passage from Yosifun, and in this passage there clearly was a contradiction to chazal. Chazal said Titus was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad person. And this passage, and this is actually reflected in the work at large, Yosifun consistently portrays Titus as a Rachman, as someone who didn't want the Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed. With the little bit that we know now of how the Rishonim treated Yosifun, let's see how this gets applied to those who dealt with this problem, with this type of contradiction. So first up is going to be Abarvanel. Abarvanel is dealing with Daniel chapter 9. And the pasuk in Daniel chapter 9 says, V'ha'ir v'ha'kodesh yashchis, the city and the holiness will be destroyed by Am Nogid Haba, by an oncoming Am Nogid. We'll see a little more about the interpretation of this verse in a second. Says Abarvanel in one of his works, Mayone HaYeshua, he passed away in the year 1508. He says as follows, you want to know the interpretation of this pasuk? Ha'ir is going on Yerushalayim. The Kodesh is going on the Beis HaMikdash. Yashchis Am Nogid Haba is going on, will be destroyed by a people that's coming in the future. Haba, that's referring to the Roman legions, who are going to be coming with Titus. And Titus is Nagid Roimi, the leader of Rome. So he teaches Am Nagid, the nation of Rome, led by Titus, the Nagid, the leader. Now, Abarvanel deals with the following interesting diuk. Notice who here is said to have destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is destroyed here by the Roman nation. It's not destroyed by Titus. Says Abarvanel, V'yiches ha'hashchasa la'amoi. It attributes the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash to the Roman nation, because he didn't want it, so it's not his fault. So we don't say, usually there's this language of, the Eisenhower took France, right? No, we're not saying Eisenhower here, because he didn't want it. He didn't want it. How do I know? Because that's what Yosifun says. And I rely on Yosifun. Chazal, what's he going to do? He doesn't tell us. He leaves us guessing. But we can understand. Just like in Chazal, following up what I said before in Rashi. Just like in Chazal, you could have two opinions and two interpretations. Remember, Rashi put Yosifun alongside Seder Olam. So Abarvanel wouldn't have a problem, if he follows in that spirit, to put Yosifun alongside the Memra of the Gemara in Gittin. So that's one approach, here's another approach. So amazing. What does Abarvanel do? He sides essentially with Yosifun, and he says this is legitimate, this is correct. However, just like before, I showed you that there's the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is reconciliation, not rejection. We're not going to find that. Later we'll find it. But in this period in history, in the period of the Rishonim and in the 1500s and the 1600s, we're not going to find rejection of Yosifun. But we will find the idea of, let's try to reconcile, let's make it work together. And that brings us back to Rabbi David Gans, the author of the Tzemach David, where he says as follows. There's a man by the name of Yosef ben Gurion HaKohen, and he wrote his book after the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And although what he says about Titus seems to contradict what Chazal say in the Gemara in Nizikin, HaPerak HaNizokin, that's the 6th chapter of Gittin, nonetheless, you should know that this individual was a very wise and intelligent person, and he was a tzaddik. And he lived before the Amoraim, a few centuries, and he saw what he observed in his day. Therefore, we don't assume he's unreliable. Interesting way of saying it. We don't assume he's unreliable. And therefore, there have been many wise people who have tried to reconcile together what he says with what Chazal say in a way that they shouldn't contradict each other. So he tells us, there's this famous problem about Titus. And he says great rabbis have tried to kind of bring them together. He doesn't tell us who these great rabbis are, and he doesn't tell us how these sources were harmonized into one. He may mean his teacher. He may mean his teacher. His teacher was a Maharal of Prague. They lived in the same city. The Maharal passed away a few years before him. And the Maharal writes about this Titus passage in 3 different places. We're going to quote from Netzach Yisrael. Netzach Yisrael is the Maharal's commentary on this sugya in Gittin that discusses the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Maharal wrote a whole book, essentially, about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and it's known as Netzach Yisrael. Says Maharal as follows. Da ki Titus harasha I efshar shaloi hayarasha. Titus, the wicked person, obviously we are dealing with a wicked person. Varei al yodei charav habayis hakadosh. He destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, hu Beis Elokeinu, u'lefichach, and therefore Rasha Gamur Haya, he is a Rasha. What about the fact that Yosifun says he wasn't a Rasha? Avohoya merachem ala briyos, but constantly having compassion on people. Kol ze'enoi, this is incorrect. Ki davar she'i efsharhu, this is not possible. Ki mishu toiv lo yaveh mimenu ra klal. Because if indeed he was compassionate, the Beis HaMikdash wouldn't have been destroyed by him. So because the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by him, I know that he wasn't a compassionate person. But one second, maybe the Beis HaMikdash wasn't destroyed by him. Doesn't Yosifun himself say that he didn't want it? So Maharal is aware of that problem, and he continues. Even if we're going to agree to the author of Yosifun, that he spoke against burning the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, Maharal is not sure. Should I believe it? I don't know if I should believe that. But even if I will believe it, let me tell you what pshat is. It's what he said. How often does it happen that a politician says something, but they want something else? The policy they would prefer is something else, but they can't say it. So that's what happened over here. In other words, and this actually works well with Maharal generally in his approach to Agadah, chazal are telling you what's really going on. Yosifun, or this man, Yosef, he can only observe what he sees with his fleshik oig with his physical eyes. What does he see? Titus says something. What does that mean? What's going on behind the scenes? Historian can't know. He could only guess. He can't know. Chazal know. And Chazal said that he said it, but he meant something else. He wanted that it should be destroyed. Or he goes on to say, maybe he actually didn't want it to be destroyed, but he wanted to keep it. But why did he want it to keep it? For his glory, to say, look, I defeated the Jews. I defeated their God. I could do in the Beis HaMikdash whatever I want. So, for an ulterior motive, not out of respect. And so therefore, he says, you know what, okay, I can believe what it says in Sefer Yosifun. I'm able to work with that material, and I could harmonize it with Chazal. He does for a moment suggest that maybe we should reject this. Maybe we should reject it, but at the end of the day, he can't. And he can't because this is not something that is done at this time to just say, Yosifun, throw it out. No one's doing that. And so while he throws it out there, like he tests it for like a hot second, but then he immediately comes back and says, no, okay, no problem, we'll embrace it. But he was doing it, he wanted it destroyed, or he wanted to keep it, but for all the wrong reasons. And so therefore, Chazal therefore said what they said, and all of a sudden the historian and the theologian work in tandem together, no problem. That's reconciliation. Perhaps that's what David Gans means in his Sefer Tzemach David, where he says that we don't just throw it out. We try to reconcile it, and we try to bring it together. Or in other words, what's happened, what I showed you here about Titus, is something very similar to what I showed you before when we spoke about Rashi and Rabbi Yehuda ben Klonimus. What did Rashi do? Rashi said, Chazal said this, Yosifun said that, and left it like it. Which is very similar to what happened over here, where Abarbanel said, yeah, we're just accepting what Yosifun said, and it is what it is. But then I showed you that Yehuda ben Klonimus tried to reconcile them, make the two work together, and that's what indeed happens here with the Tzemach David and the Maharal doing this for this story of Titus. Okay. What you don't have over here is, beside for that fleeting thought of Maharal, you don't really have someone says, just throw out that whole passage. We don't have that. At least not yet. Now let's stay within this era. Late 1400s, late 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and let's look that the Chachamim in this age, who were aware, because remember, we already showed that Reb Yehuda Mashkoini was aware of the Greek version. What do the rabbis have to say about the Greek version? Is it treated the same? Is it treated different? So we're going to look at two passages. First up, Reb Yomtiv Lipman Halevi Heller passed away in 1654, the author of the Tosfos Yomtiv. The Mishnah in Shkolim in chapter 6 discusses the fact that there were gates on each side of the Beis HaMikdash, and it says, Shnayim b'marav, there were two gates on the western side, Shaloi Hoya Lahem Shein, but they didn't have a name. On all other sides, there's a special name for each gate, like Shar Nikanor, for example. On the western side, there is no name. This is what the Mishnah says. Good. Now, you know from last week I told you, the Tosfos Yomtiv, the first edition came out in 1615, and that's when he didn't know about Sefer Maccabi. But then when he published his work for a second time in 1643, he added Sefer Maccabi. Well, something very similar happens over here. Because he has this passage that says, he goes on to quote, Yosifun leroimim, this is non-Jewish, Yosifun, which we're going to just call Josephus. So although he goes on to quote Josephus, this happens only in the second passage in 1643. So it looks like also later in life is when he become interested, he sees Sefer HaMaccabim. Later in life is when he sees the non-Jewish Josephus. What does it say over there? It says over there, not in Yosifun, in the non-Jewish one, it says that there were no gates on the western side of the Beis HaMikdash. It was a closed up wall. So what do? The Mishnah says you had gates. Josephus says there were no gates. So first he actually gives an argument to support Josephus. Why? Because Yecheskel has a vision of what the Beis HaMikdash is supposed to look like, and there's no gates on the western side. And the Rambam in Hilchas Beis HaBchira writes that much of the second Beis HaMikdash was built per Yecheskel's Nevuah. So now you have two arguments to say that there were no western gates, because Yecheskel's doesn't, and the second Beis HaMikdash is built along the line of Yecheskel, number one. And number two, Josephus says there were no gates on the western end. Maybe we should listen to this Josephus. Says the Tosfos Yomtiv, no. We don't move from what the Mishnah has to say. So I don't have the Tosfos Yomtiv talking about Yosifun in a similar area, but it happens to be when it comes to Josephus, is he willing to give it credence? He teases credence for a half a second, just like Maral before teased non-credence for a half a second, but then he immediately runs away from it. And he says, no credence, we're sticking with the Mishnah, let's just reject this non-Jewish work. But much stronger comes from Abarbanel. And I remind you, Abarbanel just a few minutes ago told us a passage in Yosifun, and he embraced it wholeheartedly, without even trying to reconcile it. Well, Mayoni Yeshua, in the exact same work, in the exact same section 10, he deals with a problem. The problem is that in the Roman Josephus, there's a calculation of years. And the calculation of years for the second Beis HaMikdash comes out to Tov Reish Mem Shana, 640 years. V'oimer ani, he says, Shazeh HaMispar Asher Zachar B'Shem Yosifun, this number that is mentioned in the name of Yosifun, hu sheker, this is a lie. Chazal's tradition is considerably shorter, 420 years. So he says, you actually notice, he's writing, it's a number that they say in the name of Yosifun. In other words, I don't think that really came from Yosifun. I'm not sure that really came from Yosifun, even though a minute ago he said, Yosifun kasav b'sifra l'Roman. Yosifun wrote in his book to the Romans. Here he says that they said it in the name of Yosifun. It must be a lie. How do I know? It's not in Yosifun. If it's not in Yosifun, then the existence of it in Josephus must be a lie. But then he goes on to say, I know that for a second just now I flirted with the idea that maybe this book wasn't even written by the same man. Because remember what Reb Moshe Mashkoini said? What was his name? Reb Yehuda Mashkoini. Yehuda Mashkoini said he only wrote in Hebrew. Who wrote the secular one? Someone else. Unnamed. We don't know. But it wasn't written by him. And Abarbanel just mentioned that idea as well. He didn't write it. They say, shame him, but he didn't write it. But then he goes on to say, and I already showed you the seed of this idea before, that no, then maybe he wrote both. Even if I'm going to agree, continues Abarbanel, that this Yosef did write it, guess what? I'm not going to accept this work of Yosef. Because in this work, it turns out, Harbe Dvarim Kasav Bechiluf Emes. There are many things that aren't true. Uvechiluf Ma Sheidu Alein Kisvei HaKodesh, many things that the Tanakh says. And he goes contra what it says in Tanakh, and I'll tell you why he did it. In order to get along with the Romans, to show the proper presentation to the Romans, like a slave who is subservient to a master and only could say what he knows they want him to say. Remember, he's writing these works when he is not in Eretz Yisrael anymore, when he is in Rome, and he's under the auspices of Titus and his families. And then he goes on to give more examples of where you have in non-Jewish Josephus, in where you have contradictions or differences with Tanakh. He has a whole list. So he quotes on Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim, there's a battle. And in this battle, it speaks about 500,000 people lost in battle. Chamesh meyos elef ish. But if you go to non-Jewish Josephus, the number is reduced. Instead of 500,000, it's 50,000. There's another passage where it speaks about David HaMelech bringing in 100,000 talents of gold. Well, he reduced it to 5,000 instead of 100,000. Uchaela Rabbi Sima, there are many other examples. Again, the motive he puts here. Shem Yerasai pen yiktzefu olav. Bedabra imam divrei yisroinois shaloi higiu lahem. He was afraid that they were going to jump on him for using numbers or high numbers that they weren't used to. So therefore, hechnifam bedabroi kolvavam. So he basically said, you know what, I'll say what they want to hear. And then he goes on to say, I have no taina to the non-Jews for quoting this and thinking this is real and legitimate. You know, how would they know any better? But my taina is to this man. This is really amazing, because this is where he's thinking right now, it's the same Yosef who wrote both works. And he embraced the Yosifun work. And for that, only praise. And in fact, I didn't show you the passage. But elsewhere, Abaranel says, yeah, Yosef wrote Yosifun, and he was a Talmuder of Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he's Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said is a chassid, right? So the guy is great when he's doing Yosifun. He's great. When he's doing Yosifus, that same person is horrible. You could think in history about some other great figures who wrote more than one work, and one very embraced, and one a lot of people had problems. An example that comes to mind is Rambam, Mishnah Torah, Mer Nevuchim. Some people don't like Mishnah Torah and they embrace, they love Mer Nevuchim, and some the other way around as well. It's not our topic for today, but it seems that that's what Abarbanel is doing. I love Yosef when he's Yosifun, and I despise Yosef when he's Yosifus. In fact, he goes on to say that Hu be'emes bichlal kidvar Hashem baza. He disgraced the word of Hashem. So therefore, how could we ever take proof from here? And therefore, don't bring me any kashas on chazal from Yosifun. Pretty clear, he means from Yosifun when he is Josephus. Because the Chachamim, they were just as good as him, and they were actually smarter than him, and they were Reishamayim, and they weren't, they didn't have to be biased by making the Romans feel good or anything like that. And so now, he easily could have said and transferred this over to the Titus passage, but he didn't. He didn't. Why? Bapashtos, because the Titus passage is in Yosifun, and Yosifun is a Jewish work, and it was quoted generation after generation, and so therefore he doesn't feel compelled to say this about Yosifun, and he only says it about Yosifus. Okay, now, our focus here was on the period of the Rishonim and the earlier Achronim, 1500s and the 1600s. When you come to the generations thereafter, there's so many more opinions and so much has been said about this, but I want to bring it from here, I want to bring it now to the Rebbe. And as we go through this text, I'm going to tell you what I think we're going to see, and then we'll see it. what we're going to find is a very, very deep skepticism on multiple levels, not only from Josephus, but from Yosifun. So let's have a look. First up is the Sikha from Parshas Tetzaveh Tavshin Mem Gimel. The Rebbe here was talking about the menorah, the well-known question of what did the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash look? Were the arches straight or were they semicircular, and all of that. So during the Sikha, the Rebbe spoke about the idea that the Arch of Titus describes the menorah as having semicircular branches, but who's to say that that was the actual legitimate menorah used in the Beis Hamikdash? Why would it be something else? Because of Yosifun. Yosifun has a passage in chapter 95 where he talks about Kohanim bringing two menorahs, golden menorahs to Titus. So you're bringing two golden menorahs. Why is there two? At the very least, one of them isn't the real one. And maybe even for that matter, both of them aren't the real one. So the Rebbe quotes that passage to speculate maybe the menorah that makes it back to Rome is one of those two, which isn't the real thing. Where is he basing it on? He's basing it on a passage in Yosifun. Well, the Rebbe said at the time, although the Tzemach Tzedek brings him once, the context here is not so negea, so it means like Hasidus, even Hasidus brings Yosifun. This doesn't mean that we can rely on everything he writes over there. And he says, you know why we could rely on him over here? Is because he's Meisiach Lefi Sumai. Meisiach Lefi Sumai means, in simple English, he's talking about something and he's not trying to say anything here. He's not trying to give testimony that it was two, not one. And so there's no reason to assume he's lying over here. And so it makes sense to accept him. In other words, there are other passages in Yosifun where you would say, oh, he's trying to tell me something because he wants me to think something. For example, what's an example? Titus would be a good example. He wants me to think something about Titus. He wants me to think that he was a good guy. So he says again, Vayachmal, Chamal, Vayachmal, Chamal, Vayachmal, Chamal. And in those instances, clear implication of the Sikh is you can't believe it. It's only when there's information here that there's no reason, there's no agenda, so then fine, we can rely on it. And in this case, two menorahs, there's no agenda, so we can rely on it. So this is displaying a deep skepticism of Yosifun that we didn't see in any of the Gdolei Yisrael that we examined today so far. Number one. Number two, there's a letter from the Rebbe in Igros Kodesh Chelek Tezvav Peiv Reish Samach Zayin. Someone asked the Rebbe about the reliability of Sefer HaYosifun. The Rebbe writes, Yodua, it is well known, Shekama Shinuyim V'Gamzi Yufim Huchnesu L'Soicha. There were multiple changes and forgeries that were introduced into the text. V'inyan of Darshan B'Koides Mumcha B'Miktsaya. And this requires the expertise of someone who is well versed in this field to figure out what is legitimate and what is not legitimate over here. What's the Rebbe referring to? We're talking about Yosifun. Remember, all the Rishonim, they quoted Yosifun left and right and center. No one had a problem. And the Gdolei Achronim also did that. Who's the first one that we know that actually looked at the text and said, there's problems in this Yosifun text? And not because of the bias of the author, which the Rebbe spoke about before, but because of additions made by later people and later generations into the Jewish Yosifun text. This man's name was Rebbe Azariah Mino Adumim. Rebbe Azariah de Rosi, we spoke about him in last class as well. In his Sefer Ma'or Anayim, section Imre Bina, in chapter Yud Tes, all the way at the end. This was a Sefer he printed in 1574. He says as follows, Ki kasher yeduma etzleinu, just like there's an assumption that some of the Roman Josephus has problems with the text. I'm not going to get into that today. So some sages opened their eyes, ala Yosifun, even on the Jewish Yosifun, which it doesn't matter which print. Remember, I told you there's variations between the prints. And they understood many people felt very comfortable playing around with this text. And he brings a whole bunch of proofs. So only going to suffice with his first one. He says toward the beginning of the book, it speaks about different nations. It says Franki and Guti and Lombardi and Bulgari. And he says, in the days of Yosifun, no one in those in the areas of Rome or anywhere like that used these names or knew of these names. This must be a later edition. He says this. He goes on and gives other examples as well. I can't tell you for sure that the Rebbe is referring to the Ma'aranayim, but I do know the Rebbe refers to Ziyufim that are Huchnasu l'Soichai. And the first one to talk about Ziyufim that were Huchnasu l'Soichai was Rebbe Zarya min Adumim. So far, we have two strikes with this text. Strike number one is, I don't know if the author is all that reliable. That's strike one. Strike two is, even once you get past that, the text is corrupt, and therefore it requires expertise, which not every person has. Go back to the letter. The Rebbe therefore continued and said, so when it comes to these types of questions, chazal, you should know the teaching of Chazal and Gemara and Shabbos Daf Kuf Mem Amid Beis, where it says, Heicha da'alyo yarka, instead of eating vegetables, le'al bisra v'kavre, eat meat and fish. Why should you fill up on vegetables if you could fill up on meat and fish? So what's he saying here? Why should you waste your time on Yosifun, which is question mark, if there's so many other productive and good things you could do? Learn another Blat Gemara or whatever it is. Ubefrat, the Rebbe continues, Kishasafik and Gam Yarku, maybe this is even vegetables. That's really sharp. Okay? Why fill up on vegetables if you have fish and meat? This may not even be vegetables. It may even be worse than vegetables. But then we come to the next passage. Here's a letter in Tavshem Mem Daled to a man by the name of Reb David Shputz. Reb David Shputz wrote a sefer called Kvoid Habayis. It's a commentary on Maseches Midos about the Beis HaMikdash. Ma'asher hinini gam ken kabbalah sifrei Kvoid Habayis. I recognize having received this, your sefer Kvoid Habayis. Oisif ha'ara klalis, I want to leave you with a general comment. B'negei l'samchos ha'yosifun, about the reliability of Yosifun v'dai kanusoi b'kayotza bazeh, and his being meticulous about the details. Sherabim iruru al zeh. Many people said that it's not so reliable. And he quotes here the Alter Rebbe and Shulchan Aruch saying you're allowed to read it on Shabbos. Why are you allowed to read Yosifun on Shabbos? Because it has lessons in life to take from it. Yerushalayim lessons you could get from it. But at the same time, there is inaccuracies in this work. He doesn't say why. So far we spoke about two things. We spoke about the author being just a non-reliable author, and then we spoke about the transmission process not being one that was perfect. Here the Rebbe just says this problem's there in the text and gives a dogma. Now I didn't have too much time to look into this, so we're not going to go too far into this. But he quotes from chapter 55 of Yosifun, and where it describes the Chatzer of the Beis HaMikdash, and he says that there were ulamais, these large rooms, on the four sides outside the Beis HaMikdash, and the length is 250 amas arkoi, and the roichav, the width, was 100 amas. A long description. The Rebbe says, Shalei nimsal is a zeicher klal berazal. There is no reference whatsoever to this type of thing in Razal, by our sages. Okay, fine. So this is an example of Yosifun saying something that's different from Chazal. I showed you before, that wasn't a problem. What happened? Rashi was very comfortable saying Chazal said this, Yosifun said something else. We had Reb Yehuda ben Kloinimus also trying to reconcile, trying to bring it together. It wasn't a problem for him. Abar Renel also wasn't a problem for him. Reb David Gans, even the Maharal. This wasn't a problem for anyone. But here, you see, this is the Rebbe is bringing one example that's a problem. But now, look at the next line. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the next two lines. Uchvar heiru, there have been those who already pointed out that the way he describes here the method of building was true centuries later. What's that mean? What's the Rebbe hinting at here? In other words, Yosifun wasn't written when it's purported to have been written. It's reflecting a reality of many centuries later. You don't think so?
No, the Rebbe is saying that. Remember, the Rebbe said that the second thing that people put.
Oh, okay. So, so either the book is a later book, or this passage is a later edition. Fine, no problem. But then continue. Or he who translated the work into Hebrew made an error. 1 second. We had two options so far. One option was that he wrote, Yosef wrote his work in Hebrew, and then later the Gentile, fine. He wrote it for Jews in a Jewish language, and then later the Romans and the Greeks came and took it. That was option one that I showed you before from the Hakdama, Yehuda Mashkoini. Option number two, which we saw Abarbanel actually referring to it, and we saw it as well in one version of the Yosifun itself, was that he wrote both. But at the very least, he wrote the Hebrew. Here, the Rebbe seems to be saying, it was written in a non-Jewish language, I think maybe Greek or Roman or something like that, and there was someone who was matik l'lashon hakodesh who made an error over here. So I'm not 100% sure. But it does seem like this is getting us into another model, and either it is or it isn't. But let me tell you what that other model is. The other model that has been that I would say is kind of like the scholarly consensus over the last few hundred years. I didn't spend too much time reading about this, but the scholarly consensus is that there was a Jew sometime in the 800s or the 900s in Italy who takes the Greek Josephus, or the Latin actually, I think that there is the Latin Josephus, and some other works, and creates a Jewish work based off of that. And that's how you get Yosifun. Is that what the Rebbe is referring to over here when he says hundreds of years later, which would explain why you have this odd way of building? Is that what he's referring to here when he says the matik l'lashon hakodesh? I can't say for sure. I don't know. But I do want you to be aware of this other way of thinking about this, the structure of what this work is, which therefore really leaves us, and now I want to expand it to the way Jews have thought about Yosifun. I'm actually going to say it in 4 ways, because till now we said 3, but I want to tell you the 4th, because I think the 4th is also important. Most Daily Yisrael, this was implicit in what I said before, never even heard of the non-Jewish version. So really, that's a category for itself. What did Yosef write? 1 book. What was the book? Yosifun. Finish. End the story. I think Rashi and many other Rishonim fit in that category. That's number 1. Number 2 was the recognition that there's 2 works, but it was written in Hebrew, translated then into foreign languages later. Option number 3, was that it was written originally in both languages. And Abarbanel accepted that proposal, but then at the same time rejected the non-Jewish one we saw, even though he accepted the Jewish one. Option number 4 is that it was written originally in Greek for the non-Jews, and that a Jewish work was created considerably later based on that. Whether the Rebbe is indicating that or not, I don't know. But what I could tell you for sure, I can't compare the Rebbe to all the Gdolei Yisrael that lived throughout all the generations, because I didn't have the time to look at every single rabbi. But definitely if you go back to the period of the Rishonim, and definitely if you go back to the Gdolei Achronim that lived in the 15 and 1600s, the Rebbe does seem to be at a different place, because he's consistently expressing skepticism about not Yosifus, about Yosifun, something that we don't really see in the earlier sources. Well, the Rebbe seemed to suggest clearly that he's not such a reliable person, A, and B, that there were additions that were added in later, and maybe the Rebbe is also thinking about the possibility that it wasn't even written originally in Hebrew, but that happened at a later date. So this is a story essentially about a book. And yeah, it's a complicated story about a book that's quoted widely in Jewish literature. I will add, one time in the Likutei Sichos, when the Rebbe wants to talk about the concept of Hama'ad Beit Atzma L'das, about the taking of one's own life, the Rebbe, that the Ein Lo Chelek L'Olam Haba, so the Rebbe has a collection of sources on the Likutei Sichos, and one of them is actually to Yosifus, to Josephus, not Yosifun. So that's actually really interesting, just to make things a little more complicated for all of you. So let's just conclude and note that this week is going to be Asara B'Tevis. And Asara B'Tevis is the day that the whole thing got started. because it was the Matzar, the siege for the first Beis HaMikdash. And really the second Churban is a continuation of the first. So all these tsaras really begin. The whole story that we began with, that concluded with the burning of the Beis HaMikdash that we began today's year, really begins on Asara B'Teves, the siege of the first Beis HaMikdash, which is a reminder and something that if you read Yosifun or Yosifus, you'll see a lot, the infighting. The sinas chinam that Chazal spoke about is depicted at great length in both of these works, and Jews throughout the ages took that message to heart. The Inyonei Musar and Yireh Shamayim that the Rebbe referred to before, one of them is very much about that. So let Asara B'Teves be a day of reflection about Avas Yisrael and Achdus Yisrael.